Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We'll just give it a couple more minutes and then we'll kick things off. Yeah, okay. Well, we might kick things off. Well, officially, everybody, good morning. My name's Mark Kindness. I am the General Manager of APPA, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is part of a series that APPA is presenting to members on ESG reporting, so environmental, social, governance reporting. Today's webinar is particularly relevant for members due to the implementation of the Australian government's new mandatory reporting regime that's coming into effect in January 2025. So that's literally a month and a half away. Under the new regime, businesses will be required to report on their sustainability and climate impact. And while this initially applies to businesses with turnover of 500 mil or 500 employees or more, the threshold will be lowered over time. But if you work with or supply one of the businesses that are now called reporting entities, you'll be required to have transparency across your business. So they will consider you part of their supply chain, and you will need to report to your clients who report to the market. To help us navigate our way through on how to report your business, I'm pleased to introduce you to Mike Smith, founder and CEO of Aclymate. Mike's a PPAI business partner, and he was a keynote presenter at the recent PPAI Product Responsibility Summit. And Mike's joining us from Colorado. APPA President Rob Williams and I had the pleasure of seeing Mike present at the conference, and we thought that Mike was the perfect person to speak with members in Australia and New Zealand. By way of background, Mike works with promo industry companies across the US and helps them to measure, report, and reduce their climate footprint. But just before I hand over to Mike, please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. You'll need to do that in the Q&A panel, and the team and I will keep an eye on those, and we'll ask them at relevant parts during the presentation. So on that note, it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Mike. Thank you for joining us.
Mark, it's great to join you all, and thank you again for having me. Yeah, good morning there in Australia. It's a nice afternoon here in Colorado as the sun's going down. I can also say that I've been to Australia a few times. I was in the U.S. Navy and had the chance to travel fairly extensively. Love the country. Can't wait to bring my entire family there here soon. Let's talk about climate. So my background, I used to fly F-18s, like I said, for the U.S. Navy. Spent about 12 and a half years active duty doing that. After I left the service, I started a company called Renew West, which was about planting trees in areas burned by wildfire for carbon offset production. In that work, I ended up planting 2 million trees in Northern California. It's the largest carbon offset reforestation project in U.S. history. So quite proud of that. I got to take my kids to do that. Super fun. As a result of that experience, I developed certain expertise in carbon offsets and carbon markets. Was an advisor of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which are the 26 states that stayed in the Paris Accords when the Trump administration pulled us out last time. The Climate Alliance is still around, so I'm sure the Trump administration will pull us out again. You know, my services may be called upon again. But in that capacity, I developed an understanding that even experts were having a little bit of a difficult time understanding some of this material. And I really wanted to make sure that this is really presentable to folks that where sustainability is not their full-time job. And so that's the context of this presentation. Any one of these topics could be a college level class. So this is a very kind of at the wave tops sort of discussion. But as Mark alluded to, if you do have questions or concerns going through, please make sure to drop those questions into the chat. I can anchor down at any one point and kind of extend the conversation there for a little bit. So there's that. Last thing I would say here, I am the CEO and the founder of Aclymate, a carbon accounting solution for businesses without sustainability teams to measure, reduce, report, and if interested, offset their footprint all for an affordable price without having to develop sustainability expertise. Would love to help you all there in Australia or wherever your travels may take you. So getting right into it. Let's start with a few of the climate basics. What are we talking about when we talk about net zero? You may have heard this term. Sometimes it's confused with the concept of going carbon neutral. They are not the same thing. Net zero started kind of entering common parlance around 2015. This is kind of the victory celebration from COP21, or the 21st meeting of all the parties to the UN conference on climate change. It's effectively every country in the world associated with that. For the previous 20 conferences, they were trying to create a global carbon market. It never really worked. And so they ultimately decided to take a step back and to change the science into political goals. And so the science talked about that there was a series of ecological tipping points that when we started exceeding certain temperature thresholds, that bad things happen and we can't go back. They're one-way check valves. And so what the science said was that for the stability of human civilization broadly, we should set a goal of no more than 2 degrees of warming above the pre-industrial average, 2 degrees C, and that if all possible, we should try to remain below 1.5 degrees on the ideal. So that's what they talk about. And so that's the goal. Now there's the path. How do we get there? And effectively what we needed to talk about was there needs to be a peaking of emissions that happens. One of the bits of good news, having now been in climate for about a decade, is that when I started, we were very, very much on the uphill. Like we were globally watching emissions not only going up every year, but going up more every year. And so it was like a ship heading to the rocks, and instead of turning away, we were accelerating. But since COP21, a lot of things have been happening, and we're actually pretty close to peak now. And so that's a really exciting development. And so it can feel a little bit frustrating when you hear about some of the things that are happening to us in climate, in the political ecosystem, et cetera, about like where are those going. But like we should also take pause and celebrate that small victory, which is that like the ship is turning. We're no longer heading directly for the rocks. So we have to peak the emissions, but now we got to start cutting them. And one of the things that came out of the Paris climate goals was that we need to cut our emissions by 50% by 2030. And then the theory is that every decade thereafter, we need to cut 50% of the remainder that decade. So 50% by 2030, 50% of the remainder by 2040, 50% of that remainder by 2050, getting us to roughly around a 90% emissions reduction. But the problem with that is that as long as emissions are greater than the capacity of the Earth to capture it, then it will continue to pile up in the atmosphere. And so we're going to have the atmospheric concentrations continue to rise. But again, that 90% by 2050, if we can cut our emissions by roughly 90% by 2050, and at the same time ramp up the ability of the Earth to capture carbon from the atmosphere and to store it, at that point, that's when we get to net zero. Okay, so it's an important concept that when we talk about net zero is primarily emissions reductions, but there's also a component of emissions capture or associated with that. So we have to both cut the positive and increase the negative ways that we interact with the atmosphere. Let's talk some fundamentals of carbon accounting. How does the atmosphere warm up? Greenhouse gas emissions. What are greenhouse gas emissions? Well, there's 6 different categories of them, and you can get fairly technical on them. But roughly, the big ones that you should be kind of paying attention to are methane, or I guess methane, depending upon your pronunciation, Industrial gases, which include things like refrigerants, and then, the granddaddy of them all, carbon dioxide, or CO2. So carbon dioxide is by far the largest emission that happens from human sources on the planet. It's also the least impactful on a pound for pound basis. So since it's the majority player, and since everything else has more impact to carbon dioxide, they're converted in an equivalency known as a global warming potential back to carbon dioxide. Some of them, like nitrous oxide, for example, doesn't even have carbon molecularly in the structure of the gas, but because it's converted roughly at about 80 to 1 to carbon dioxide, it's known as a carbon emission. So even though you'll find things without carbon in them, they'll still be called a carbon emission. And just know that it's a colloquial way of saying that. The standard unit of measurement is a metric ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent, sometimes referred to as a TCO2e or an MTCO2e. And if you ever see that abbreviation again, I'd be surprised, because almost everybody refers to it as a ton of carbon. Again, it could be 1/80th a ton of nitrous oxide with no carbon in it at all, but the equivalency of that is a ton of carbon. The equivalencies you can find in the IPCC AR5 report if you're really concerned, and they try to convert the emissions intensity over a 100-year time span, because certain gases have different half-lives in the atmosphere, and when they're in the atmosphere, they have more or less impact. More on that later. Okay, so that's probably the most technical part of the conversation there. Moving from that, you move into emissions scope. And you can think of scopes as scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 is how it's broken down. And you can think of them as degrees of direct responsibility or business relationship, kind of on a scale there. So for those that you are directly responsible for, those are known as scope 1 emissions. In this example, you control what is doing the emitting. So this might be like the gas that's being burnt in company vehicles or refrigerant leaks. Natural gas you might be using to heat facilities. But there are some kind of weird ones out there. For example, talking to some vineyards, the carbon dioxide associated with fermentation and the production of wine would be a scope 1 emission. Those are different things to think about. But for most of you, you should think about it as these are the things that you're burning or leaking that are carbon related emissions. Moving slightly further afield, where you have the machine, but you're not controlling what's going into the machine, is kind of the way to think about it, is scope 2, and that's consumed energy. For 99% of applications, that's electricity. So you control the light switch, whether it's turned on or turned off, but you don't control how the power company is converting either photons or rocks into energy, right? It could also be district steam in certain industrial processes. It might be chilled water, but like I said, for 99% of applications, this is electricity. And so you may notice here that there's a relationship that, for example, the power company's scope 1 emissions, where they're burning the coal in order to generate the electricity, is your scope 2 emissions. Then you have scope 3. Sometimes you can think of scope 1 and 2 as a kitten and scope 3 as a tiger, because scope 3 can be a much more complicated sort of thing. There's 15 different categories, but they roughly break down into upstream and then downstream emissions. And so upstream emissions are just what they sound like. Downstream emissions are just what they sound like as well. But here it's all about the value chain. And the value chain is about like that. Okay, you don't get to control what happens above or below your company, but you do get to control whether you're engaging in that business relationship and how you're setting those terms. Scope 3 is why, even if you are not directly regulated, you need to be paying attention to this. And that's something like that I want to foot stomp here. You or somebody else's scope 3 emissions, and so you're going to have to pay attention to that. But examples of scope 3 emissions might be corporate travel, it might be employee commuting, it might be shipping, and it might be like a use of product. So historically, scope 1 and 2 were things that companies would take responsibility for if they took responsibility at all. Scope 3 would be something they'd say, no, we don't take responsibility for that. That's how fossil fuel companies for years would say, oh, we're only selling a product that people care about. It's their decision to make a change there. But again, it's a relationship. And so what's happened is that we've lost the acceptance, the social license, and in many places, just the regulatory acceptance that you can have high scope 3 emissions where you can sell gasoline and not be responsible for its consequences to the atmosphere. So that's kind of on like the moral standpoint. But the other point to think about here is that scope 1, 2, and 3 illustrate risk. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more here. So again, it's relationships, it's risk, and it's how you account for that. You can directly measure a lot of the stuff that becomes scope 1 and 2 emissions for you. Scope 3 becomes a lot more complicated, and you start thinking about things like spend-based accounting, where X dollars of spend in certain categories equals Y footprint. We do a lot of that at Aclymate. And then in other places, you'll have like an activity-based accounting. Don't get too lost in it right now, but just know that scope 1, 2, and 3 are that. And that your scope 1 emissions are the people that you're selling to scope 3 emissions, and vice versa. What they do with the products that you sell them are your scope 3 emissions. You've probably heard a lot about offsets. So that's the next thing that we'll talk about here, just kind of briefly. And so historically, you may have heard of the term like carbon neutral. And sometimes people substitute carbon neutral for climate or for net zero. Again, that is not correct. Carbon neutral was, okay, you measure your scope emissions. A lot of times people just measure just scope 1 and 2, and then they'd buy some offsets and say, okay, we're good. Again, the social license for that has faded. Carbon neutral is not seen as a very widely accepted term any longer. In order to be net zero, you need to be having an emissions reductions profile. It's not just enough to account for your footprint. You need to account, so measure, reduce, and offset. So offsets fall into roughly 2 buckets. You have on the one side avoided emissions. And this is where you're paying a company to not pollute. And that may not sound super sexy. And in the long term, avoided emissions will not be an acceptable pathway. But in the short term, they're kind of essential. So a couple of examples here would be like livestock methane or renewable energy. A livestock methane project would be where in a feedlot operation where they collect the manure, and the manure anaerobically digests and release a lot of methane to the atmosphere. You can capture that methane and destroy it, usually by burning. And because methane is 25 times as bad on a 100-year time span, for every ton of methane you destroy, you get credit for 25 tons of carbon dioxide, or 20. So there's some advantages to that. And so, some of these projects aren't awesome, like in a storytelling way, but like in a subtle way, they're actually really awesome. Because in many ways, like carbon dioxide, the next 20 years are the most essential from a climate standpoint in like all of the human history and all of the future. And methane over the next 20 years is not 25 times as bad. That's over the 100-year time span. Over the next 20 years, methane's 80 times as bad, 85 times as bad. And so you're actually making more of an impact over the next 20 years per ton of methane that you're abating than you're actually getting credit for. So some nuance there to think about as far as that. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to avoided emissions. On the other side of the equation, you have carbon removals. And this is a little bit more of an intellectually pure exercise where you pollute, somebody else is cleaning it up, therefore everything works out and we're good to go. And this is what I used to do. Planting trees, they grow, they absorb carbon from the atmosphere, they store it into the body of the tree. You've got good things going on there. Alternatively, you might have direct air capture. I kind of think of these as like the kind of like the vacuum cleaner from Spaceballs, where it's like sucking the atmosphere, and it's kind of the same idea here. Other than like to steal it for nefarious, ends here, what it's really doing is scrubbing the atmosphere of carbon dioxide. Takes that out, injects it deep underground. It's kind of almost like reversing the burning of oil. pretty energy intensive and pretty expensive. Some projects are kind of a blend of this. So like for forest preservation, for improved forest management, might have part of it where it's avoiding the emissions of the trees being cut and then managing it for the trees in the future to capture carbon. So it gets a little bit blended, but just understand that roughly there's avoided emissions and there's carbon removals. All right. So 3 steps about like what your company needs to do on climate. The first one is you got to measure it. You don't really know where you're going until you know where you are. And so don't assume anything. The best example I have here is we had a company that used to fly people in, or still does fly people in from all over the world. They have a pretty good air emissions footprint associated, or air travel related emissions. And they just assumed there was nothing that could be done about that or anything. They were already really efficient, et cetera. And then when they sat down, they measured their footprint. They realized that they had 2 employees that commuted 40 miles each way in pretty low efficiency pickup trucks. And when they didn't have a class in for all these international travelers to teach people how to install solar panels, they didn't have a reason for these guys to come into the office. They easily could have just worked from home. Effectively, by telling Doug to stay home, they actually cut about 7% of their emissions that year, right? So don't assume anything. Use the measurement, use the data in order to inform your decision making. Don't presume. Second step, reduce, measure, reduce. That's what you got to do. 90% of the problem is emissions reductions. That's where you got to spend most of your effort. That said, you're going to want to stay ahead of regulations. And the way to stay ahead of the regulations is to think about it from the science, which is why I started the science and the political goals, which is why I started with the Paris Accords. Everything is being aligned around that. If you're in alignment with that, you're generally going to be in line with any regulation that's coming up. Finally, offset. Offsets had kind of a rough bit in the news media there for a little while. As somebody that used to work in the offset space, I would say that was mostly deserved. The offset market needed to kind of clean up its act a lot. The other side of it, I would say, though, is it's also essential. When we showed you the yellow curve and the gray curve in order to get to net zero, there's no pathway to our climate future without also fostering carbon capture in the long term and the rapid reduction of emissions in the short term. We got to bend that yellow curve down as fast as we can. We got to increase the capacity of the earth to capture carbon. So offsets should be a core part of what you're doing, even if it's outside of a regulatory environment. Pause for just a second here. Mark, have there been any questions coming in so far? Nope.
No, okay. Well, you must be doing an extremely good job, Mike. There are no questions right now.
Okay, or everybody's well asleep or enjoying a scone or something. Yeah. So off to measure. So that's kind of the framework we'll talk about here, measure, reduce, offset. Why should you measure? Again, I'm going to start in chronological order. I promise I'm going to talk about the Australian regulations, so but it's going to come at the end rather than the beginning of the measure discussion here. Even before COP, the Europeans were kind of moving on this. And then even since COP21, they've really kind of expanded on the regulatory landscape. CSRD, SFDR, there's a whole alphabet soup of a bunch of different regulations here. So don't get too worked up about the letters there. Also understand that outside of the EU post-Brexit, the British have essentially created the same laws, just with, I guess an emblem of the crown on it. The general short of it and long short of it is that if you're doing business with somebody in Europe that has more than 250 employees, they have to do a full scope emissions reporting. They also have to forecast on where their emissions reporting is going. And that's it. Scope 3 reporting means because they can't really measure, they can estimate what their footprint is associated with your business activities. They might do that in the short term, but in the long term, because they're going to have to increasingly start to decarbonize, they're going to start requiring you to report your footprint. So if you do business with anybody in the Eurozone or Britain, then you're likely going to have to report. Alternatively, the SFDR there, requires that investment houses have financial disclosures associated with their footprint as well. And so this all gets around the idea of risk. Risk showed up in a big way at COP26, which was supposed to be 5 years after COP21 in 2020, delayed by the pandemic 1 year, remained in Glasgow. So COP26, the big thing that came out of it was this announcement. 40% of the world's wealth, roughly $130 trillion of assets under management, literally the most bananas large number ever uttered in the history of markets, was committed to a net zero future. What does that mean? Well, it means that they formed something known as GFANZ, or the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And it's that of the world's top 50 asset managers, 37 of them committed to this, 24 of the largest asset owners, 33 of the largest banks committed to a net zero future. These are huge, massive piles of money. They include, institutions like BlackRock, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund here in the States, the California pension system. Big chunks of money. Now, are they moving all their money into net zero only? No. What are they doing? Every time that they have to roll, from one fund, that fund is over and it's time to reinvest that money, they're now requiring new funds to start reporting about, like, what's their footprint? What are you doing to manage your footprint? So what it is it's a great big ship with a whole huge amount of mass. It's an aircraft carrier on top of an aircraft carrier. All of it turning very slowly. But every year, though, a lot of that mass, as it turns, moves more and more the track of things. For my 2 cents, this is probably the biggest forcing function in climate outside of the regulatory landscape. And it's caused companies to start behaving like that. Why are they doing that? Why does business care about this at all? Risk. The way to think about this is that in a climate-constrained future, companies that are investing in high emissions activities are going to see increasingly a more and more fragile business model. They're going to start to see assets that are going to be more tied up that might be exposed to pretty massive regulatory tipping points. And when those environmental tipping points happen, the social license for continuing to do some of these emissions related activities are going to disappear very quickly. It's like the old Hemingway quote, how do you go bankrupt? Gradually, then suddenly. It's the same idea here, right? They might gradually feel that pressure until all of a sudden they feel it pretty suddenly. So it's about risk. How do you manage your exposure to where your business might be going from a climate perspective? So even if you dismiss all of this as kind of unnecessary, just know that all these businesses all these major businesses care about this because financial institutions care about it, because it's a massive business risk for them if they continue down this path.
Yeah. Mike, we do have one question that might fit into this. We've got a question where another gentleman called Mark has asked where the US leads, the world generally follows. So with President Trump-elect saying he's withdrawing from the Paris Accord, what will that mean for the future of ESG and the flow and effect of climate reporting for businesses? I know this is sort of looking forward, but what are your views on that?
I would challenge the assumption that where the U.S. goes, the world follows. Pains me as an American. I served up my country. Like I wore the flag on my shoulder for better part of a couple of decades. On climate, the U.S. has had like a massively leadership role. Frankly, COP21 would not have happened without a bilateral agreement between the United States and China that broke a really long-standing logjam in kind of the between the developing world and the industrialized world. And so I think the U.S. when it leads on climate is a really important player. But what happened in the previous Trump administration is when we pulled out of the Paris Accords, nobody else did. Literally the U.S. was the only country on the planet that wasn't in the Paris Accords. We weren't leading. We just left. Nobody followed.
Mm.
That doesn't make you a leader. It makes you a scallywag.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some interesting things that happened on the at that time too. Is like COP26 was a direct outcome of on the financial side of
Mm-hmm.
the recognition that we shouldn't be solely waiting on governments to act. That it's actually there's a lot of opportunities for businesses to act here as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the investment funds associated with climate, that bending of the curve, most of that happened during the Trump administration here in the United States.
Okay.
And so I challenge the assumption there. Now, is it good that Trump got elected? Nope, not from a climate perspective. It is a unalloyed bad news. I think we would go further faster if we had the world's largest economy, the second largest emitter, historically the largest emitter, pushing to do something here. I think that would be a much better situation. But we'll talk about it here in a minute. The U.S. has actually been lagging the rest of the world when it comes from a regulatory landscape.
Okay. Yeah. So in a sense, it's probably Europe we need to look to more so than what's happening in the US.
I actually think the Chinese, we don't talk about it in this this presentation.
Right.
The Chinese now have a vested interest in manufacturing a lot of this stuff.
Okay. All right, cool. Thank you very much. I'll come back when there's another question.
Yeah. All right. So GFANS, Glasgow, what has that driven us to? Well, for all those folks in the promo space, these are some players that you should know and care about. Disney now requires that their suppliers should have public reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. They're encouraged to set targets and implement action plans for reducing impacts. So there you go. Amazon, suppliers should track, document, and report greenhouse gas emissions. They're going to prioritize those with emission reductions plans. You want a preferred contract with Amazon, you probably need to get on board. Moving out of CPGs, Aviva, insurance company, their net zero goal is 2040. They want to be there 10 years ahead of the Paris Accords. So if you're doing work with them, you're going to have to accelerate your timeline. Microsoft is kind of like the King Kong, the granddaddy of the whole thing. And they set a net zero, not only a net zero goal, but that they wanted, irrespective of size, all their suppliers to track full scope emissions and cut them by 55% by 2030. That's what you got to do if you want to work with these folks. They're just representative of many, many, many other countries or companies, I should say. So in the US, the SEC adopted rules to enhance standardized climate-related disclosures for investors. It's the weakest law of all the industrialized countries, and it was to report scope 1 and 2 emissions. The original rule had scope 3 emissions in it, and you had to analyze and report climate-related risk. As we've talked about, it's probably going to get trumped. The last time this guy came into office, they rescinded something known as Clean Power Plan on day one. And the Clean Power Plan was this government regulation that was from the Obama administration that was supposed to decarbonize the electricity generation sector. It hadn't been around long enough in its finalized form for it to withstand, being revoked by the following president. And so literally on day one, Trump killed it. At the end of the day, it didn't matter. We actually achieved all the goals of the Clean Power Plan in the United States because the rule had been around long enough that it had created momentum within industry anyways. I don't think any company that has been working to kind of get ahead of the SEC disclosure law here to really abandon their efforts. Again, we've just kind of, especially if they have any exposure in other regulated spaces. One of those regulated spaces, California. California passed a law where if you have a business presence in California and you do over $1 billion of revenue anywhere in the world, you have to start reporting your emissions next year. That's not just public companies like the SEC would cover, but also private companies. So it's about 5,300 different companies. It's a full scope emissions reporting, scope 1, 2, and 3 associated with this. And if you're unfamiliar with kind of the US system, it's a hodgepodge of federal and state laws. But California is the largest economy in the United States. I think as a state, it's larger than Australia's entire economy. It's so big that, and you aren't going to do business in the U.S. and not do business in California, which is just kind of how it works. So the law here is going to push pretty much every company that under its regulation to enact these behaviors across all the United States and all of its operations around the world, literally. So California is pushing pretty heavy on that. Historical precedent on that was fuel economy standards associated with automobiles in the 70s. And so the US EPA has its own emission standards. For a long time, California's exceeded them. They actually drove the US auto industry in order to comply with California laws. So similar things happening here. Okay, let's talk about Australia. So the Australian Accounting Standards Board is now has a law where if you meet two of these thresholds, whether it's revenue, assets, or employees, then you got to start reporting. So if it's over 500 million in revenue or $1 billion in assets in 2025, you got to start reporting. Or if it's 200 million in revenue and 250 employees, you got to start reporting in 2026. But in 2027, this is actually getting pretty far down into the economy at that point. So greater than 100 employees. So this is actually more sweeping than the European regulation. And 50 million of revenue or 20 million in assets, 25 million in assets. You start looking actually like that's a lot of mid-sized companies that are going to have to start reporting on that. What do you got to report? Well, you got to report a full scope emissions reporting and set targets. You need to be talking about governance, a risk management strategy. Again, talking about that. Not only from like your exposure from your emissions standpoint, but risk management from like facilities. Are you in a place that's likely to flood or burn down or, run out of a water supply due to drought? And so you need to be thinking about kind of your operations there on those. You need to include that in your strategy disclosures. The other thing is there's opportunities here. So you're going to have to be disclosing this. Bottom line from all these regulations is that you or someone you do business with will need to report your emissions for compliance reasons. If not now, very, very soon. So how do you do that? Well, option A, you can do it yourself. Knowledge is free. The internet exists. We've all gone to the Google machine and tried to figure it out. So if you do it yourself, other than the salary you're having to pay for it, it's free. Can be pretty comprehensive. Bluntly, nobody knows your business like you do. So you'll know where to kind of give it that look. It can be pretty intimidating as a weakness, right? Like there's kind of a whole new lexicon here. It is very much a numbers-based sort of thing. There are ways that you need to do this right. Data collection can be a bit laborious as well, associated with that. So you'll have to kind of work on that. Option B, historically, this is where most people would turn as consultants. The strengths is brand. You get to point and say, well, you don't worry about us. Like we hired, this person with a sterling reputation. They're the ones that did the carbon accounting. So you're going to get that glossy report that you can point to and the brand associated with it. You're going to have a little peace of mind because you have an outside expert that's doing the work. So there's that. Weaknesses, it's kind of expensive. I think also the other part is it's pretty periodic. Typically, you hire that consultant, they do the thing, and then they say, okay, I'll see you in a couple of years. And what you're left with is the glossy report and trying to figure out how to do it yourself. Option C, roughly, are digital solutions. The strengths are it's continuous. So you have the ability to kind of keep this accounting going, just like you wouldn't do your financial books and just be like, oh, see it in a year. You have to kind of keep the books up to date. You should do the same thing with your carbon accounting. The best solutions are automated in a lot of ways too. Like they can integrate with your existing data systems, your financial accounting, your utility provider, for example, and ingest that data directly. So you don't have to go and upload bills or type in things. It's just, there should be a degree of automation associated with it. It's kind of the Goldilocks solution. It's not as cheap as doing it yourself. It's not as expensive as a consultant. So there is some priciness there. And it's also not completely hands off. You're going to need somebody on the team that has a responsibility for, keeping an eye on things. Does it need to be a full-time body? Nope. Does it, but somebody wearing that sustainability hat or climate hat. Small pitch for Acclimate here. We can help y'all. So it's affordable. We've got 3 different tiers of service. It starts at like $10 a month. We also, you get the opportunity to work with real humans. So we have great customer support. We have additional services when needed. So for example, if you want a fractional bookkeeper to just take care of all this for you, where you just throw your garbage over the fence and we sort out the recycling, we're your folks. We are built for companies without sustainability teams. And we do have experience with the promo industry based upon both our connection with PPAI and now here with APPA. All right, let's move on to emissions reductions. So across the world, there's a bunch of these different markets where you have carbon markets and carbon taxes. From a policy perspective, there's really just not that much difference. 73 different jurisdictions have created some sort of carbon market or carbon tax. When I say there's not much difference, there's kind of the world of difference is in the details, but like at the end of the day, like a well-constructed carbon tax starts looking a lot like a well-constructed carbon market. I have some policy preferences one way or the other. We could nerd out about that if you so care. Assuming you're not nerds, I'm going to move forward and just tell you that you have markets there in Australia, also in the United States, not as extensively. The US, it's either on the coast mostly. So at the state level, you have it in Europe and in China as well. So all the major industrialized areas of the world have this. And the short version here, what happens here is that failing to cut emissions, if you're within one of the covered industries within one of these various markets or tax areas, cost you money. And that cost goes up and up and up as the longer you go with that. So it creates a financial incentive for them to decarbonize. And I think that's important for you all to think about, which is that like when you're trying to decarbonize, you don't have to do it all at once. Again, the goals are 2030 and 2050. So you just got to do a few percent every year. And that means that there are other people that are going to be doing it as well because of the relational nature of carbon accounting. That means that even if you did nothing, your emissions are probably going to go down. So just do your part. You're part of kind of the web of companies that are all doing this work. Acting on climate is really good for brand. So the United States, UK, Australia, bit of a survey here. You'll see very, very similar rates for interest in sustainability broadly. And these are, respectable sample sizes, 500 to about 900 in each one of these surveys there. What it shows is that the public concern for sustainability grows with time. I mean, it's grew 4 or 5% in just a couple of years. And where you see surveys about US population or British population, I guess we can all blame the Brits for what's going on, but then it's also fairly representative of probably what's happening in Australia, even if you don't have direct data. So just more of a subjective rather than an objective look at it, but you can take trend analysis that way. One of those trends is that millennials, who now are the oldest millennials are over 40, so entering the peak of their economic and political buying power, they care about climate a lot. Gen Z is a little less motivated there, but they're growing in their interest as well. I collectively like to refer to them as the climate generation. They're people that have been growing up their entire lives, knowing and caring about this and not understanding why we haven't done anything about it already. So for US consumers, again, this probably reflects closely to what would happen in Australia. 34% of US consumers are climate aware, where they make a decision, when they make a purchasing decision, they're considering the impacts of climate as part of that. 23% of them are climate conscious, where it's it is a deciding factor in their decision-making process. Which interestingly, so 57% total, but of that 23% for the climate conscious, they tend to be wealthier. They have a 50% larger checking account than the average in the US. And so these are people with more disposable incomes. Very typically the kind of customers most people want. If you want to employ from the climate generation, survey of US millennials found that 3/4 of them would take a pay cut to work for a socially responsible company. Here at Aclymate, I can attest to this anecdotally. Our last open position, we had 130 applicants, and I pay peanuts because it's a startup. If you are looking to hire talent, being aligned there is good. The flip side of that is 83% of, or part of that is 83% of millennials would be more loyal to companies that help them contribute on social and environmental issues. And then the flip side of it is that almost 2/3 of millennials won't work. Like it's a hard stop for them to, if it's a company with poor CSR practices. Denver's an oil town. I know people in the oil industry. They are not. It's an industry that is paid well. They're still having a hard time finding people that are willing to work for them. I've got 130 applicants for a job that pays peanuts. Well, the oil companies are having a hard time finding employees. What can you do in promo to reduce your footprint? Think about your shipping. Air freight is really, really bad. It's roughly 10 to 50 times higher emissions per mile of things being shipped. I know there's kind of this just in time or last minute shipping sort of mindset, especially thanks to, Amazon and all the rest of them. So where you can avoid that, you should. Maybe it's pre-positioning associated with that, you can. Distance matters a lot. So you kind of get this double effect here too, right? Which is you can rack up a lot of miles in a hurry with airplanes. So try to avoid the mileage. Sourcing locally is best when you can. Roughly, think about it. The bigger the vehicle that touches the surface of the earth, probably the more efficient it is. So like ships are more efficient than trains. Trains are more efficient than trucks. And as you would expect, it doesn't touch the earth except for takeoff and landing airplanes. So think about that. Product composition matters. Different materials come from different sources. About like when you're thinking there, it's largely an engineering and procurement problem. So when I say engineering and procurement, so on the engineering side, if you have a product that uses metal, if it uses steel, if you can substitute without aluminum, then it's probably far, far more efficient. And so if engineering can meet the same engineering spec with aluminum, consider switching to that. On the flip side, maybe engineering cannot. And so then it becomes a procurement problem. Engineering needs a specific type of metal. Recycled steel can be 90% lower emissions than virgin steel. And so think about like, does the recycled steel meet the engineering spec requirements associated with it? And look at that. So think about that. Also think about more than just like raw or virgin versus recycled steel. Think about the steel producer. Again, as you're starting to think of your scope 3 emissions footprint, one producer, even if it's the exact same end material, may be a much more efficient producer than the other. And this is where you're starting to have the power of your relationships in order to push climate accounting as well. Think about remote work. More remote is almost always better, as kind of illustrated by Doug and the solar installers. It's not zero. You do have responsibility for the emissions of your employees' home in fraction when they're working from home. But unless they're commuting by some of the most efficient means possible, they're almost always it's almost always better for them to be working from home. Selective air travel. This is going to be a hairy one for people in Australia leaving Australia. Within Australia, maybe not so much. I'd imagine it's mostly just direct flights. Do see where you can find efficiency associated with it. So the example here is if you have, we're going to go visit 5 or 10 different customers, onesies, twosies, can you go meet them all at one conference? Would be the way to think about it. Also, as a former pilot, I can say takeoff and landings matter a lot. Where possible, avoid layovers. If they are layovers in the route of travel are clearly more efficient. So think about that. On some of the emergency profiles I used to fly, you could burn as much as 50% of the fuel just on the takeoff and climb out. So avoiding takeoffs is a big advantage there. Any questions on this?
Okay, so it's probably a question more around accreditation. So the question is, there are a number of eco accreditation programs out there, so EcoVadis, B Corp. Does it matter for reporting an end customer preference, and how do we know which to pick? Or does it matter, especially as distributors are service-based and really have the most effect on level 3 emissions? That's probably a 25-barrel question there. Starting off with, let's talk about accreditations. Does it matter for reporting an end customer preference?
Yeah, so there's 3 different kind of buckets of standards that we all need to think about here. The first bucket is the standard of how do you convert the data that you have into emissions data. The industry is mostly coalesced around something known as the greenhouse gas protocol, or the GHG protocol. Aclymate uses it, almost everybody else does. Like, I wouldn't worry about that too much. On the other end of the problem, you have like target setting standards. It's not totally coalesced yet, but it's mostly coalescing around something known as SBTI, or the Science Based Targets Initiative, in where you set a science-based target. Large companies have one process that they have to go through with SBTI in order to do that. But there is an SME standard for that as well. So there's that. In the middle, you've got this messy kind of accreditation and reporting standards, and it can be another alphabet soup. So you got like CDP, EcoVadis, SASB, GRI, all of them. You also have B Corp. They are all roughly, so the science-based target is to get you to do your share of the Paris goals, right? So again, if you start with the Paris goals in mind, everything else kind of falls into place. How you report into EcoVadis and B Corp. So the B Corp, like for example, they've just updated their standard in order to align with the Paris goals. So in order to be B Corp certified, you're going to have to do that. How do you report to B Corp or EcoVadis or CDP? You use the greenhouse gas accounting protocol, which is again, everybody's using, right? And so what you report into that is going to have to be your carbon accounting for that. Now, around the carbon accounting, each one of those reporting standards has different things. Some of them want to know more about, your risk. Some of them might be looking for like a product level accounting. So, you'll have that. My advice to you is none of them have like the broadest brand recognition right now. And so if you have you're a vendor to a company, if you have a customer that's requiring you to report into those systems, use those systems, right? Like that's how you keep that relationship. And maybe you start with that. But don't feel like you have to jump into them first. You can do the accounting now, know that it's going to be in alignment with pretty much all those reporting standards. And when somebody comes calling and asking for it, you'll have it there.
I'm just trying to get myself off mute. That probably captures the whole piece in that question there. So yeah, so thank you very much for that. And I'll let you know if we get another question pop up.
Looks like we got one from Guy Dawson.
Oh, okay. Can't see that one.
Yeah,
oh, here we go. Guy Dawson. Okay. Most airlines offer a carbon neutral option for a small fee. Does paying the fee make air travel okay?
So there's a moral question associated with that. Is air travel okay? Right. And so if you never traveled ever again, right, you're going to have carbon emissions, right? Does that mean that like using electricity is okay? Does it mean that like driving your car is okay? Right. And like, yeah, I think we have to like be a little bit more qualitative, right, rather than categorical here about like our thinking. Is air travel okay? Yeah, it's not great, but if you got to do it, you got to do it, right? And so I guess ask yourself, and do you have to do it is the first question. Anything, right? Is this something that you really need to do? And kind of work back from there. And if you don't need to do it, Is it something, like how badly do you want to do it? And just think about that. But like I think we need to move beyond this kind of point of shame and just like taking ownership for making just the small decisions correctly over time and repeatedly. And so there's that. Now, from a pure carbon accounting standpoint, whatever you do to offset it doesn't really count, right? So it's not like if you, just like we talked about, like that carbon neutral doesn't kind of wipe it away anymore. You don't get to, even if you offset it, you still have to record it as a flight, right? So it's still on your emissions books. The offsetting comes next, which is why offsetting comes next in the conversation, right? Offsetting is after the emission has happened. And so you still have to report the emission, right? And so that's removing any sort of like subjectivity around it. That's just how the accounting is done. I would also say that for the airlines, there's some advantages if you do want to offset your footprint from working with the airlines, because they typically have more informed offset buyers. And so there's probably some degree of quality that can be assumed in that. But then there's also, you need to have like a little bit of buyer beware. So for example, in the United States, United Airlines has a sustainable aviation fund that they've kind of positioned kind of like an offset, but it's really a way for, maybe you don't have this in Australia, but in the US, like now practically every time you go to the checkout at the grocery store, the supermarket, it asks you, do you want to donate, $1 to kids with cancer or the hungry or, more veterans or whatever. And you're like, yeah, okay, great. Well, then like what ends up happening is that company marks that as revenue and then gives it and then marks it as a charitable donation off of their books, which is not really the intent of the whole thing anyways, right? And so like so make sure that like if they're talking about offsets here, that they're not doing some sort of thing where they're like, oh look, we're investing in the future, and it's really you paying for them to claim investing in the future. If you want to invest in the future, heck yeah, do it. I love it. But I would say put it on your own books, not on Qantas's. All right, moving into offsets. We're approaching the end, folks, so stick with me. But this can be some of the most complicated. So let's take a sip of coffee real quick. Offset registries. There's 4 big ones known in the offset space: Climate Action Reserve, Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry, and Verra, or CAR, Gold Standard, ACR, Verra. Sometimes you'll hear Verra referred to as VCS, which is kind of their older name. What does a registry do? You can almost think of it as like crypto without the bro. So it's they create a ledger like you see on like kind of a blockchain system where you can see who owns what, and they also have a proof of work, like a way that you can create this token that you've done something for the climate, right? That token happens to be a carbon offset or a carbon credit. And there's no blockchain here. The ledger is really just a public registry that you can go to. Every one of these companies right now, you can go log into their website and you can literally see every offset that's ever been created, transacted, and consumed throughout its entire history. You can go do that right now. And that's a big part of what they do. The proof of work part is there's so many different ways that we interact with our atmosphere. And so how do we measure like how an offset is created? Well, they create these recipes effectively. They're called methodologies or protocols, but it's like, if you follow this recipe, you will get a carbon offset. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but these recipes, these methodologies, they have a review process. They have to go, there's a public comment process. They all go through peer review. And so they're fairly defensible. So it's worth looking into. And what they end up doing is they create a market in the voluntary carbon market space. The market's broken down into 3 phases. You have these project developers. This is what I used to be. I used to be a project developer. And so when I went to go find my project, I had to go out and find the landowner, find financing, kind of get all the pieces put together. And then I would submit to the registry. In our case, it was Climate Action Reserve, that we had this idea. They would say, yeah, that makes sense. And then once we got into an agreement with the landowner and the financing kind of got everything circled up, we would submit a project design document. And then once we did the project, then we had to have it validated by a third-party auditor. And then we waited. So I planted, a couple million trees, and they just sit. A few years from now, we're going to send another auditor out to check the reporting that we've done on the growth of the trees matches actually what was going to happen, or what actually did happen, I should say. And then it gets verified that all the paperwork is sent to the registry. They can say, yep, all the paperwork looks like it's in order. And then at that point, we get issued offsets. So it's a really, really specialized knowledge field. Can be kind of risky. Renew West was my company, but a new Finite Carbon or a couple of the others in that space. Historically, because this was so complicated, the project developers didn't talk to the ultimate buyers. And so there was middlemen that would work in this space. Sometimes there'd be that direct relationship. Sometimes there'd be a retailer relationship where you might take possession and then resell it. But most of the time is a brokerage, and there was a percentage there. In the current space, Aclymate's also a carbon offset broker. More on that in a minute. But like some of the big kids in the space were like BGC, Climeco. They would take a like a 3% management fee associated with that, and they just knew who all the players were in the space. Very, very over-the-counter structure. And it's because ultimately they were selling to offset buyers like Microsoft or Delta or Shell. And it was kind of the Wild West as far as like what this all looked like. So Microsoft, for example, is doing it because, as we talked about, they have exposure from institutional investors requiring them to do this. Delta, however, they have a requirement to offset a growth in their international emissions. Qantas does as well, based upon a kind of a compliance obligation from being a flagged air carrier in a country that is a signatory to the International Civil Aviation Organization Treaty. So essentially, a quasi-governmental organization was creating a compliance obligation for airlines to participate in the voluntary carbon market. And if that's as bananas as it sounds, it's because it's bananas. It's kind of the Wild West that's happening there. You also have companies like Shell that are, they may be required to offset in the California market for compliance reasons, but they also might be interested in buying offsets in order to sell pre-offset fuel to Delta or Qantas. And so a lot of things that were happening there. What you'll notice is that nobody like you was there. And that was a problem. And so this wasn't a very fluid market. There wasn't a lot there. And so this is all getting completely reshuffled. You have some companies like Pachama, for example, that have come in and they're trying to be both the registry and effectively the project developer and the broker, and just trust them. The offsets are good. You can buy them. And not to dog on Pachama, they are pretty good offsets, but like you don't have some of these checkpoints in there for you. For smaller companies, you have companies now that are like Aclymate, where like the brokers have actually kind of split into a buy side and a sell side. Where Acclimate's on the sell side, we're selling to smaller customers, smaller lots of offsets. We'll sell like by the pound, not even by the ton. But in order to do that, I can't maintain a relationship with the thousands of project developers. And so we interact with somebody else that does the sell side on that. Any questions on this? I know this can be a little complicated. If you are looking at offsets, a few things for you to consider. Unless you have a degree of expertise here, start with Gold Standard or Climate Action Reserve. They're not perfect, but they're better than the other two, in my opinion. And I can go into that if you care. But they generally do things right. Be careful with new technology and with Verra, which is unfortunate. Verra's got a lot of great projects in its registry, but it's been a little too project developer friendly, which is why you've been seeing articles from The Guardian and elsewhere coming out associated with their stuff there. So there's that. Think about the project type that you're looking for, whether it's nature-based or whether you want technology, whether you want emissions removal, avoided emissions versus carbon removals. Consider things like vintage. So offsets come from different years. They're produced in a certain year. The cleanest way is if you had an emission in 2024, you have an offset in 2024. Some of them, for example, especially in the new technology, they're doing ex-ante crediting. So most offsets are ex post. I had to plant the trees, wait for them to grow, have somebody come and measure them before I would get issued the offset credit. So that's known as an ex post credit. A lot of the technology ones are treating it a little bit more like a crowdfunding campaign, which is pay for it now and we'll deliver it later. But most companies are, because it's, you're not taking actual physical delivery, a lot of companies are starting to count them against their books this year. That's not cool. So recognize that. In the market, a lot of people will say old vintages you should avoid. I disagree with that, actually. Again, there's a holding capacity of the atmosphere. If you help to avoid an emission 4 years ago, in many ways, that's better than an emission you avoided today. All else being equal. So, but just consider the vintages and expos versus ex-ante. Probably the easiest thing to do, get some help, work with a trusted broker like Aclymate, or also think about buying a portfolio. We have a great partner in the form of a company called CNOT. You can kind of think of it as like a mutual fund of offsets, where for a fixed price, you don't get to tell the project, the story of like planting little baby trees in California, but you get to have some assurance that there was an interested and informed buyer that was making the decisions, and then you get price assurance associated with that. And that, folks, is the ball game. So my name is Mike Smith. I really enjoyed presenting to all of you. That's my personal email here at Aclymate. That's also my work number there. Would love to help any and all of you. Like I said, we do have experience in the promo industry, and it's only growing. Yeah. Plus, then I can challenge my airfare assumption and then fly to Australia to meet with all of you and justify it as a work reason. So,
there's one question from Guy. Just what was the name of the fund again?
The mutual fund
kind
of structure. Yeah, it's called CNAUGHT, CNAUGHT. If you work with us, we're connected with them, so we can, we can connect you with them directly. If you don't work with them or don't work with us, Mark Chen is a great dude over there. I'd be happy to make an introduction as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And just for everybody who's watching, Mike's generously allowed us, we'll be able to share the slides with you after the presentation, and the recording will also go up into the members area of the APPA website so that you can refer to it again, because there is so much information in what Mike shared today. I'm sure we'll need to go back. It's the second time I've gone through the presentation, and I'm making new notes as I'm going through, so I'm sure it's going to be relevant for everybody to go back and access the recording. And as we see, the world changes very quickly. And I think, Mike, as you said, if you point back to those original standards and get your house in order, everything else falls into place. So with regulatory changes coming, customers asking us for more information, everything like this helps us to get prepared for a better business future, and being better corporate citizens as well. So on behalf of the team and our members, I want to say a big thank you to you for making the time to speak with us. And yeah, if we can, we should do this again a little bit further down the track.
I'd enjoy that. I always like preaching the good word.
Okay, good one. Thank you very much, Mike. Enjoy your evening, and to all our members, have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
Take care.